Welcome back, folks. It's the War Room powered by Pro Football Focus, and it's week 10. That's almost hard to believe that November's staring us straight in the face. The fantasy playoffs are approaching, but we have a full slate, well, not an entirely full slate, but a slate of games nonetheless in front of us today, and I'm your host, Jeff Ratcliffe, getting ready to do some start-sit questions. With me this week, the incomparable Mike Clay. And, of course, filling in is Scott Spratt, filling in for Pat Thorman this week. Scott doing some awesome work for us as well. Mike, what's going on today?
Oh, not too much. Some early, just kind of looking at the news here. Looks like Calvin Johnson probably going to be a full go today. Looks like Monte Ball, if you were kind of looking at him in desperation today, hoping he'd maybe reclaim a chunk of his role. Looks like he's probably not going to play today. So all Ronnie Hillman, if you have him, outstanding running back one play today.
Yeah, absolutely going to look at that one. A couple other things coming across, but before we get to those, Scott, got to give you your props here for joining the War Room. This is your inaugural voyage here on the War Room. So welcome, and how are you today?
Hey Jeff, thanks for having me on. Yeah, I'm feeling pretty good. Normally I've got my Sunday routine, but I'm willing to break it for you guys because you do a great job, and I'm glad to be on.
Absolutely, and we're glad to have you. So much going on Sundays, of course. A ton coming across the wire. Just briefly here, too, I want to address this because I know the IDP folks who are tuning into the show are going to have some questions about Patrick Willis. It really doesn't look like he's going to play. You never like when you have a player who is essentially limited one week, doesn't go, and then the next week is missing practice. He missed practice all week. That would indicate that he's basically not playing. That means Chris Borland again this week, and yes, he put up 18 total tackles, 15 solo tackles last week. So if your question is where is he ranked, I'm going to have him about number 12 overall this week, which means he's an LB1, and he should be in your lineup. This is a great matchup against the Saints. They've been giving up a lot of points to linebackers this season. But before we get into the rest of the stuff, I wanted to preface it with that. I do have to plug our sponsor, of course, DraftKings. They're giving away $1 million a week now, and actually they just bumped the prize pool up just a little bit. Now it's not $27 to enter that contest, but it is $40. It's still reasonable. Hey, $40 at a shot for $1 million. You want in on that. If you're not playing daily fantasy sports yet, what are you waiting for? It's taking over the fantasy industry, and you want in, and we can get you in. If you're watching this on the YouTube feed, maybe you're not sure if you want to subscribe, you don't know if you want to invest. Well, $10 will get you a subscription to PFF Fantasy Gold if you just head over to DraftKings and deposit that $10, initial deposit of at least $10 with the promo code PFF, and you will get Fantasy Gold. You'll get our daily tools. You'll get all great rankings, content. We have award-winning writers in our presence. I have two of them next to me right now today. So both Scott and Mike are award-winning writers, and Mike has more hardware now than he knows what to do with. So get in on it, folks. All right, let's get in on the start-sit questions. Remember, if you're hanging out with us, you're a subscriber, you can come into the Hangout. You can ask your questions in the chat. You can ask your questions live. And if you're just watching us on the YouTube feed, you can certainly hashtag on Twitter War Room, and we'll do our best to get to every single one of those questions throughout the course of the show. Also, if you hop into the chat after you're done your question, just make sure you head over to that YouTube feed and watch from there. And Mike, George has a question. Looks like it's a bit of a flex question here, and he's got a whole stable of folks in a half PPR. And he needs to choose between Jamal Charles, Andre Ellington, Denard Robinson, Kelvin Benjamin, Martavis Bryant, and Odell Beckham. Obviously, Charles looks like he's going to be a lock in there, probably Ellington as well. But where are you going with that other spot?
Yeah, that other one's a little tricky with half PPR. Denard Robinson against Kelvin Benjamin's where I cut it down. Odell Beckham, I don't think is a serious threat there to Benjamin for this spot, especially going up against these Eagles cornerbacks who are just getting destroyed this year. So for me, I'm going kind of upside here, especially with Toby Gerhart starting to play a lot better. I know Denard is a plus matchup today, obviously against Dallas, but it's also a situation where if Jacksonville falls well behind, they could be throwing a lot, and that would mean a lot of Jordan Todman on the field. That could cost Robinson some carries there. So I'm leaning towards Benjamin this one. I just think the ceiling is very, very high up against Kerry Williams and Bradley Fletcher today.
Scott, what do you think in there?
I agree with Mike. I have Benjamin the highest. I sort of have Benjamin, Robinson, and Beckham all within sort of a 10 rank spot difference in my flex rankings, but I think Benjamin is the best conservative play because you feel very safe that he's going to get 8 or more targets this week against the Eagles.
Yeah, I agree with that one, and obviously, tossing Bryant. Bryant's producing touchdowns at an unsustainable rate, and Beckham gets a really tough matchup. I love Beckham, absolutely do, and love having him on my roster, but this is a week you might want to fade him. So I would go with that there, George. And you have an IDP question here. You're asking about benching Lavonte David. I know the concerns. It was limited in practice all week, but if this guy's good enough to suit up, then he's certainly good enough to put in your roster. If you've been paying attention to the tackle report, you've seen that Tampa is one of the more favorable venues, perhaps one of the most favorable venues for tackle production this season. It's not elite level. It's not with the Giants, Jets, and Bills, but it's up there. So you're not benching him for J.T. Thomas, though I do like that you own J.T. Thomas. You've been paying attention, so that's very good. All right, let's move on to we have nobody's in the chat live, so over to the chat. Kelvin Benjamin over Vincent Jackson in the flex in a PPR. Mike, would you make that move this week?
That's a close one there. I have them guys back to back. I think that Vincent Jackson is very undervalued right now. He's still getting a massive target volume. I mean, I know a lot of people are looking at Mike Evans as possibly their number one wide receiver now. That hasn't been the case all season. It's been Vincent Jackson. He's still getting a massive target volume, even though Evans has been getting the touchdown. So, Jackson usually very good in the end zone on those end zone targets, allows him to score a lot of touchdowns. Only, I think he's 2 of 11 now in that department this season, so not doing particularly well. That figures to change in the second half. And he has a decent matchup, although Atlanta's been better than we kind of expected over the last 7 weeks or so. So I think Jackson Hill's a decent matchup, but for me, it's so close there that I think the ceiling is just plain and simple. It's just higher for Benjamin against this Eagles secondary. So, I already talked about him a bit and the reasons why I like him a lot, so I'll give him a tiny edge there.
Are you feeling the same way, Scott?
I have a little bit more edge for Benjamin, and there's a couple points of uncertainty that I think I want to ask Mike about here. One is that, Tampa is switching quarterbacks, going back to Josh McCown this week. Is that something you see as a positive or negative for Jackson? And two, isn't Vincent Jackson a little bit banged up? That's maybe a reason why I have him outside of my top 20 when normally I have him as sort of a mid-teens guy.
Yeah, I mean, Jackson, week 1, 26% of the targets, week 2, 35%, and I think that was the 2 games McCown played the whole way, and in game 3 he did see 29%, so he's consistently been force-fed the ball this season, so I'm not particularly worried about volume in that department. In terms of effectiveness, Mike Glennon hasn't been too good, so I don't think much of Josh McCown either, but either way, it's a situation where it's a bad quarterback that's going to throw a lot of passes his way. Obviously, a concern here is them scoring points, which is an underlying issue with Jackson all season long. And as for the injury, that a lot of these guys are beat up. I don't put a lot into that unless it looks like the player's going to be limited. But we've just never seen that with Jackson. He's a good bet to play almost every down.
Yeah, and in that first contest against the Falcons, he saw a ton of targets, Vincent Jackson. He only caught 2 of them. I think he saw 10 targets off the top of my head. But it was the play of Robert Alford. Hopefully they can do a little bit to maybe free him up because the play calling just didn't look creative at all, though that really shouldn't surprise us with Lovie Smith. But I'm not going to shy away from playing Vincent Jackson this week for sure just because of that volume. But in this case, yeah, it is going to be Kelvin Benjamin. By the way, if you're looking to save some money in your daily leagues this week and you're in a GPP, this isn't a cash game play, but in a GPP, Josh McCown. I know it's crazy, but you got to do something a little different to win these things. And you're playing a bargain basement quarterback there. It's going to allow you to free up some money elsewhere, so you can stack your lineup. So you could do a whole lot worse than that. All right, heading over to Jimmy's question here, and he needs 3 wide receivers for the rest of the season. And this is a whole slew of wide receivers that a lot of them tend to fall in a similar range in our rankings for the rest of the season. So, Mike, we got Mike Wallace, Brandon LaFell, Steve Smith, Eric Decker, Allen, I guess that's Keenan Allen, and Reverend Randall. By the way, folks, that's a pet peeve of mine when you switch back and forth between referring to a guy by their last name and then another guy by their first name, and it can be confusing. confusing. So I'm assuming that's Keenan Allen. So who you got if you had to take 3 of those guys for the rest of the season, Mike?
Man, that's a tough one. There's some guys in there. I knocked Steve Smith out of there right away, so it knocks it down to 5. And these guys are all pretty close. I mean, LaFell has been, he's been pretty odd for a while, probably even longer than it seems the last couple weeks. He's been getting pretty hefty target volume since around week 3. So I do like him a lot in this offense. It's playing pretty well. I think I'd include him in there, and I think Keenan Allen's pretty much a lock as well. He's getting more volume, actually a lot more volume than he did last season when he had that huge rookie year. And the touchdowns are just the issue. I think they'll regress going forward. So I like LaFell and Allen. Wallace, Decker, Randall, I mean, pick your poison there. I mean, Randall probably not playing particularly well, so we can eliminate him even though the volume is massive there. That leaves us with Wallace and Decker. I think I prefer Wallace a little bit more because that offense is playing well as opposed to Decker, where we're still dealing with that questionable quarterback situation, although he is getting a massive volume, which provides some optimism. But for me, if you can maybe make a trade there with these guys, I think that there's no reason to say one guy is a guy that needs to be locked on your roster. Just go ahead and try and maximize the upgrade. Maybe trade 2 for 1, or maybe go out and get a running back or a tight end upgrade. But either way, it's a good situation to be in.
Scott, what do you think there?
I generally agree with Mike's broader point, which is that a lot of these guys are ranked closely together, and I would definitely try to trade some to make a little bit of an improvement. And maybe because of that, we have some slight differences in the players that we would select. Mike throws out Steve Smith immediately. Steve Smith's one of the 3 that I definitely would like to have. I think he's clearly still the number 1 receiver in the Baltimore offense. But then beyond him, I think I'm leaning towards Mike Wallace and Eric Decker just because of consistency in terms of both targets and production this season. But I would have a hard time throwing out LaFell just given the recent uptick in his production.
Yeah, it's really tough to have all those guys on one team. I'm keeping LaFell because he's that guy in that offense that is starting to click, and a lot of potential there. Well, it's really hard though. Keenan Allen, I agree, and then from there you're basically you're throwing a dart at one of these guys, and like Mike said, if you can get some value for these guys, you're going to want to go ahead and do that. But we have a couple folks hanging out in the actual Hangout itself, looking like you're ready to ask potential questions. Hey, Sean, are you here to ask a question live?
Yeah, I'm here to ask a question. I was just wondering, standard scoring, flex option, Mike Evans or Ruben Randall this week?
What do you think, Mike?
I'm going. I'll jump in. I'm going to go Randall. I mean, I know he's going up against Seattle, but I think you may see an uptick in targets and he's already seen a high volume in targets. I don't think the matchup will hurt him a lot because, he does not play on Richard Sherman's side. I know the logic here says Randall up against Sherman, but Sherman usually doesn't chase guys around. He does sometimes, but it doesn't really make sense in this game because they have Odell Beckham and they have Randall, and you can make the case that Beckham's the better player. He's shown that so far, and Beckham does play on his side since he's taken over for Victor Cruz, and he's in the slot as well. So I don't really hate either of the wide receivers. I'm not really downgrading them because of by a significant margin with the Seattle matchup, just because, although Beckham's going to see a lot of Sherman on the outside, he's going to do a lot of damage in the slot as well. So for me, I give Randall a tiny edge over Mike Evans up against Atlanta just because I think, he'll be fine with target volume.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Pat, did you have any thoughts on that one? Or?
No, I generally agree with Mike. I have both of them within the 40 to 50 range in my flex rankings. I probably lean Evans because I think the matchup is much better given that Atlanta, who's just not very good. But again, it's very, very close.
I think I'm going to go with Randall there too, like Mike, just because of that volume. And I don't want to be the guy who owns Randall and misses out on the week where he finally catches all these targets. I do think it's coming, and it could be as early as this week. So that's my 2 cents there. Is it Chaim? Do you have a question for us?
Yeah, it's Chaim. I got a flex question in a non-PPR. I could flex either Lamar Miller, who reported to be limited, Mike Wallace, or Steve Smith.
Again, I'm Wallace and Smith. I mean, it's pretty close. Miller, Smith, Wallace. I do like Smith a little bit more than Wallace this week. The Miami passing game has Detroit. Detroit, outstanding defense. They probably don't get the respect they deserve just yet. And that Miami-Detroit game may end up 12-9 or something. I mean, it should be a low-scoring game. So I'm gonna get Wallace out of there. But when it comes down to looking at Smith, probably a back-end wide receiver too. Miller, probably a decent running back 2 option. If you compare, projected points in those areas, you're going to lean towards the running back here. So start Miller. Hope he finds the end zone.
That is a really tough one because you're talking about essentially, arguably, the 2 best defenses in the league right now going up against each other in that Miami-Detroit game. So it's tough, but I do agree with Mike. You're going to probably lean towards the volume over maybe the higher ceiling. So Scott on that one, or?
Yeah. No, I disagree with you guys. Like I agree that you want to go with the volume, but I'm not sure Miller's going to get it if he's as limited as is reported. I think it could be a bit of a timeshare there with some of the other backs. I'm concerned he may not get more than 10 to 12 total touches today, and given that, I think I would prefer either Wallace or Smith. I have Wallace slightly higher, but both I have higher than Miller this week.
All right, thanks, guys.
No problem. All right. Remember, folks, if you're hanging out to ask questions, that's fine and dandy. Once we get to your question, if you don't have anything else for us, could you move over to the YouTube feed? We'd greatly appreciate it. There's limited space in the room. I wish it could be endless, but there is limited space, so thank you guys for that. We got a question about Mark Sanchez here from Mike W. And I suspect that this is going to be a question that some people will have for us. And if you're just thinking about this, I mean, I know everybody thinks about Mark Sanchez. They think about the Jets version. But let's face it, this is a guy who performed well in the preseason. I never like to just project over the preseason to the regular season. But he showed up last week in relief, over 200 yards, 2 touchdowns. Yeah, he had 2 picks, but you don't care about that. You want numbers, and he put up numbers. And honestly, I think I could go out and put up numbers in Chip Kelly's offense. So the comparison here is between Mark Sanchez and Russell Wilson. And it's ultimately who has the higher floor because we've had some disappointing outings from Russell Wilson recently. So, Mike, just gauging the landscape here for this week, what do you think about that particular question?
I'd go Wilson here up against the Giants. I know he hasn't really been throwing touchdowns, but I think he'll come around. That Seattle offense we know is decent, and I think they're going to produce. So I give him a tiny edge. And all the points you made about Sanchez are correct. I do like him going forward. I think he's a borderline quarterback one, which is basically where Foles was. I mean, Foles has shown this year, and this is coming from probably the biggest Nick Foles apologist out there, that he's not really progressing into a very good quarterback. He's just kind of leveling off at decent/inconsistent, we'll say, maybe even worse than that. So, Sanchez, again, not a guy I like at all. I very much haven't liked him his entire career, but he's stepping into a great opportunity. We saw him in this offense in the preseason. It's the preseason, of course, but he was outstanding. He wasn't just okay. He was outstanding in the preseason, and he showed decent last week as well. I think this is an offense that can allow him to produce. And I went out and tried to get him on waivers, especially in leagues where I had Foles, because I think you can count on him for, again, borderline quarterback 1 production going forward. That said, this week I think Wilson just a tiny bit better matchup up against the Giants.
And one of the things, too, about Foles that, we certainly know is he wasn't particularly mobile. At times he makes Peyton Manning. Hold on a sec here. Let's get out some. At times he makes Peyton Manning look fast, and that's saying something. But Sanchez is a much more mobile quarterback. Depends on, obviously how well he's going to run a lot of those zone read plays, the read option type plays, but could actually have some points there with his legs as well. So I do agree with that assessment. But, Scott, I want to give you an opportunity to throw your 2 cents in here about Russell Wilson and Mark Sanchez.
Well, you're talking about it from Sanchez's perspective, but the reason that Wilson has a higher floor is because he's a mobile quarterback and could get, 40 to 50 yards on the ground this week. So I feel like that's what makes him a lot safer. With Sanchez, obviously you have the passing attempts will probably be much, much higher. But if he has multiple turnovers, then that could really limit his fantasy upside.
Yeah, and let's not forget, too, that this New York Giants defense is really, sure, Jaquan Williams had 18 total tackles last week, but he didn't look particularly good on the field. Neither did Jameel McClain. So if he gets to that second level, Wilson obviously has shown the ability to really turn it up as a runner. Certainly a possibility there. So, yeah, a slightly higher floor this week, but Sanchez is somebody who absolutely does need to be owned in all leagues going forward. And we have plenty of questions adding up here. Our buddy Giles is watching on the YouTube feed, and if you are watching on the YouTube feed, remember #WarRoom, and we'll get to your questions. Giles has a question about Carson Palmer, one of the hot players of this week, or Tony Romo. Mike, what are you doing there?
Palmer and Romo, you're saying?
Palmer and Romo.
Man, that's a tough one, back to back. I'm always the guy that's down a little too much on Palmer, just because his interceptions touchdown ratio has been pretty good this year, which is not something we've seen from him in a long time. So, he finally threw a pick last week, first since early in the year, and I think we'll continue to see that kind of level out going forward. So I'm not quite as high on him as probably the industry, I would imagine. That being said, Romo, Jacksonville, coming off the injury. It's a game where Dallas should be able to run the ball a lot, so it makes this very close. That all being said, I think I like Romo just a little bit more in this game. I think he certainly has a chance to reach maybe 3 touchdowns in this game, so I'm giving him a tiny edge over Palmer.
What about you? So what are you thinking about this particular dilemma?
I mean, most weeks I agree with Mike that I would have Romo higher, but with the broken bones in his back, I'm really terrified of playing him here in his first start back. I'm really worried that pain management could be an issue, and if he gets pulled early in the game because he can't play effectively with the problem, then I just think that there's major downside risk with Romo that surprisingly doesn't exist with Palmer for whatever reason this season.
Very, very interesting, and it is interesting. The pain management aspect of Romo probably, and this doesn't get talked about enough, how many times this guy's played through some really severe injury, severe pain. So I don't know if I'd be too worried about that, but then downside, yeah, it is certainly there. If you want the safer play, it is Palmer, but I do agree with Mike that Romo has the potential to put more points on the board this week in a very favorable matchup. And we're getting a lot of questions about Mike Evans this morning. Now, this one, though, this is a dilemma that we haven't heard so far, and that's with Torrey Smith. Torrey Smith or Mike Evans in a half-point PPR. Torrey Smith is a sneaky guy this week, Mike. Are you thinking the same thing?
You know what? Smith, and again, we were talking about Steve Smith earlier. I have it here. He's 34th in fantasy points since week 5. He had that early rush this season where he was just being heavily targeted, saw 30% of Joe Flacco's targets. Since that point, it's all the way down to 21%. That's pretty much exactly what we projected. I mean, we expected almost that exact thing to happen. Right now, it's more of an even keel there in targets there between Torrey and Steve Smith. So I'm just not normally as high on Steve Smith because Torrey is coming on. He's getting the touchdowns. He's getting more volume. That being said, Torrey Smith's still touchdown dependent, still more of a lower volume than we expected, high touchdown dependent player. And I think Mike Evans really starting to come on since that injury. Although, I mentioned earlier, Vincent Jackson's still the one there. Evans is emerging, and we know he has a ton of talent. So I do give Evans up against Atlanta a tiny edge over Torrey going up against the Titans.
And that's what we call regression, by the way, folks. Mike's regression alert article came out, last week, Mike? And make sure if you haven't checked that one out, go back and look at that, read through it, study it, because there's so many nuggets in there. Of course, you can only get it if you're a PFF subscriber, the PFF fantasy subscriber. So get in on that. And this is interesting, Mike. My 2 cents here. I do like Torrey Smith as maybe a sneaky guy in daily leagues, but I do agree with you here, and I think the game script is going to set up favorably for Tampa's passing game. Obviously, last time it was a almost historically bad first half for the Bucs against the Falcons. Now at home, but still figure to be down relatively quickly in this one, and we could see a lot of Evans here. Scott, you're the dissenting point of view today, so do you have a dissenting point of view here, or do you agree that it's Evans?
I agree that it's Evans, but I will say that I think that Steve Smith is still the number 1 option in Baltimore, and the regression that I would expect is that I don't really see Torrey Smith scoring touchdowns every week going forward.
Fair enough. But still Mike Evans in that one for you. I guess it says W-wet. There you go. Now, Chris has a question about Martellus Bennett and whether or not he's going to play. Also, perhaps what we can expect of Fred Jackson. Looks like he is going to be in there. So what do you expect in Buffalo? So first, Mike, any information you have on Martellus Bennett as the show's been going on here, and expectations for the Buffalo Bills running backs?
I haven't seen anything from Chicago that suggest Bennett won't play. He seems to be on the probable side, so I'm not worried there. I would start him with a pretty, Green Bay doing a pretty good job against the pass, but Bennett should be pretty busy in that offense. With the bye weeks, Gronkowski out this week certainly makes Bennett, I think, a top 5 option there at tight end. And in Buffalo, Fred Jackson, it sounds like he's going to go. We should know here in a few minutes, and maybe we should kind of table that discussion. But if he plays, I'd be looking at him as a running back 2 option.
Very good. Yeah, we'll actually, that's a good idea. So we'll table that one until we get notice there when the inactives come out here, actually in a few minutes. Going over to Steven's question here, looks like a standard scoring league. He's got Kelvin Benjamin, Brandon Marshall, and Bobby Rainey. He needs a wide receiver and a flex out of those. And Mike, just scrolling through the projections this week, it did appear that Brandon Marshall came in maybe higher than some expect in a matchup where we really haven't seen a lot of passing against the Packers this year. But some have suggested they don't really opposing teams haven't really needed to pass because the Packers' run defense has been so bad. So, thoughts and expectations for Marshall in general. Who would you go between Benjamin, Marshall, and Rainey if you need one wide receiver, one flex?
I'd start Rainey. I mean, with Sims coming back, it looks like they're going to kind of use him as the 2 there along with Mike James and kind of mix them in a little bit. But it looks like Rainey will be the workhorse. So I would get him in my lineup. At wide receiver, I'm going to go with Marshall. I mean, you look at how they've been sharing targets there in Chicago. Marshall was seeing right around a quarter of the targets weeks 1 and 2, probably a little down from what we expected. Then he dipped significantly. He was beat up there for a while. Weeks 3 through 5 was not targeted very often. The last 3 weeks, it's kind of like the light bulb went on. They started getting the ball back to Marshall and Jeffrey. They actually, last week, combined for 51% of the targets between the 2, highest of the season, and still actually below where they were last season. And Marshall averaging 29% of the targets the last 3 weeks. So they're finally starting to go back to getting him the football early and often in games. And that's a great sign for his fantasy value. Think about where you had him coming into the season. That's probably where he's going to be going forwards, and that's why I like him.
Scott, thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I agree with Mike completely this time. I have Rainey as the number 1 of these 3 options, so I'd have him at flex for sure. And then I have Marshall as a slightly better play than Benjamin this week. Obviously, this guy's in great shape, though, if he has to bench one of those 3 guys.
Absolutely, and active on the waiver wire, very like with Rainey there. Also, folks, I know some of you are crafting those daily lineups. Hey, Brandon Marshall, I know it's one of those prices where you look at it and you're like, this is almost too good to be true. This is a trap, but he's 7,300 on FanDuel, which for potential top 10 production, he's a super value there. And on DraftKings, he's 5,600, which is even better. So you have to like Brandon Marshall at those prices. And hey, we've seen it out of this guy before. I mean, this guy has 3 touchdown upside in any given week, so you have to really like that there. All right, getting caught up on the chat room here. And looks like we have 2 questions from VJ. He's traded Jordan Nelson and Frank Gore for DeMarco Murray and Lorenzo Taliaferro. How did he do, Mike?
Jordy and Gore for DeMarco and Taliaferro. Roster construction would be nice to know what he's doing there. Obviously, Jordy to DeMarco, you have to look at that as probably an upgrade. It's always risky going to a running back, but I think you really need that come playoff time. If you get a running back who's going to produce you big points, that's very important. Gore, Taliaferro, probably pretty close to a wash. I mean, Taliaferro playing a lot, getting the goal line work there. And Gore does nothing in the passing, nothing on passing downs. He is going to see an uptick in more usage. It's being talked about this week, but it actually started in the last couple of weeks. So, Gore more of the feature back there in an offense. I think that's going to try and get back to running the football. But I don't think you really lose much by giving Gore away. So it's a pretty even deal. I'm perfectly fine with it. No problems getting Murray, who may lead running back some points going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree. You hate to sometimes give up certain players, but if you're giving up Jordy Nelson, it's very likely that you probably have somebody else there at wide receiver you're doing pretty well with. Scott, I'm going to toss VJ's question over to you. And he has a flex question between Chris Ivory, Michael Floyd, and Martavis Bryant. So players, Ivory, up and down season so far. Michael Floyd, pretty much a down season. And like I said earlier about Bryant, almost unsustainable touchdown production here. So if you had to choose one of those players, who are you going with and why?
I'm going with Ivory there. It's a pretty definitive answer for me. And I realize the reason this is a question is because last week Ivory got just 8 carries, and even Chris Johnson was the better fantasy performer. But Ivory has actually been pretty consistent this year, and I think it's pretty safe to count on him getting between 10 to 15 touches this week. And just the way that the lack of targets that have been there for Floyd and the lack of targets that have been there for Brian, in fact, beyond just those multiple touchdowns over the last few weeks. I think it just makes Ivory so much safer, and that's why I'd go with him.
How about you, Mike?
Yeah, I think Scott said Ivory. I'm kind of reading inactives here. I would go with Ivory as well. Floyd can't be trusted right now. Beat reporters saying that there's no indication that they're going to try and force him the football. We heard that after week 1 when everyone was concerned about Larry Fitzgerald, who I'm also not particularly high on. I don't think much separates Fitzgerald and Floyd. Targets have been up for Fitzgerald lately, but there's no reason to believe that doesn't switch a little going forward. Floyd more the big play guy. Fitzgerald usually doing stuff underneath, although he's seen an uptick in his yardage numbers this year. And John Brown, of course, is coming on as we have to take this guy seriously. I mean, we might be talking about him as maybe a wide receiver 3 for the next decade at worst. He just looks very good. And John Carlson even busy in that offense. And I didn't even mention Andre Ellington, who's seen a ton of volume. Not terribly far behind a guy like Matt Forte. Just he's that sort of player in this offense. So they're spreading the ball around there, and it's effective. So there's no reason to believe that they're just going to come out and just start chucking it to Floyd 10 times. Now I do still like him as a borderline wide receiver too, because of the big play, the high average depth of target, the ability. But I just don't think he's a particularly great play short term until we see more of that. And Ivory, of course, and get more of the volume this week. So I'd lean towards the running back.
Mike, we're going to stick with you. You say that you got some active news coming across the wire here. So why don't you update the folks on who's active, who's inactive so far?
Yeah, it looks like Marquise Lee and Cecil Short's both going for the Jags there. So if you were looking to maybe take a desperation shot at Alan Hearns, who had a kind of spike in value last week, maybe not the best idea there. With Short certainly going to play every down. Charles Sims is going to make his debut. That's very exciting. Possibly a feature back for this team down the stretch. Probably still probably a Bobby Rainey week, but a guy to keep an eye on. Vincent Jackson is playing. Lamar Miller also playing. And in Buffalo, Sammy Watkins, Fred Jackson, both on defense. Both of those are going to play. So maybe we should talk about those Bills running backs a little bit. What I'm kind of expecting is that I don't entirely know what to expect. I mean, I think Fred Jackson will play essentially the role he did early in the year, which is about 40-45% of the carries, maybe a slight uptick there. And he should still see a ton of volume as a pass catcher. He's seeing 16% of the targets, so should step back in and see about that today. As for Dixon and Brown, I'm not really sure what they're going to do here. Who's going to get those C.J. Spiller carries? And I think the only way to look at it is kind of expect them to kind of split them this week and then see who's the hot hand when Fred Jackson gets some time off. But, I wouldn't start either of those guys. I think they're still worth sitting on your bench, especially Brown, in case he emerges as a big player, which we know he can do. We saw that, Jeff and Scott in Philadelphia. So, I think they're roster worthy, but just not guys you want to start. Fred Jackson worth running back 2 consideration today.
I would love to see Bryce Brown actually run between the tackles. Very frustrating. We've seen that so far this season. As soon as he gets the ball, it's like he just wants to run to the sideline immediately, and you just can't do that at this level. The players are too fast. Everybody on the field, they're all elite level athletes. So, but yeah, very good information there. So make sure you make note of that. Also, it looks like Patrick Willis is officially inactive. So as I said, Chris Borland now in that must-start territory. Could draw a potentially really tough matchup, having to cover Jimmy Graham potentially a little bit here. But I expect a lot of tackles from Borland this week. And my projections love him, so you're going to want to get him in your lineups. All right, we have some questions piling up on Twitter, but one more question here in the chat before we head over to those hashtag War Room questions. And Eddie picked up Julius Thomas. Actually, we have 2 here, but Eddie picked up Julius Thomas in a trade. Now, the rest of the season, and this is like spoiler riches, these officially first world problems here. Who do you prefer for the rest of the season, Mike? Julius Thomas or Rob Gronkowski?
Oh man, how can you keep both? I mean, I'm gonna lead towards Gronk. I mean, He's the better player here. Both offenses are fantastic, but Gronkowski is not quite as touchdown dependent. I mean, both of them obviously are major touchdown producers, but Julius Thomas has not gotten big target volume. I mean, if he was in a different offense, an average offense even, or even an above average offense, he wouldn't be near the fantasy asset that he is. He just gets so many targets in the and around the end zone, and he catches so many of them because he has Peyton Manning throwing the football that it really just spikes his value, and he just, it drives me nuts as a projection guy because guys should not be producing touchdowns at that rate. Whereas Gronkowski, even if you take his touchdowns away, he still gets a pretty hefty volume of Tom Brady's passes. So for me, that's a pretty easy decision. I would go with Gronkowski.
And it looks like, just for clarification's sake, the Gronk owner, I guess, is a Peyton Manning owner because he wants to stack all the Broncos on his team. Go big or go home. But I do agree with you. I would make that trade, Julius Thomas for Gronkowski, straight up. Like Gronkowski, I personally like him a little bit more than Jimmy Graham, and I know that it may not be what everybody feels, but just Gronkowski, the targets, the consistency, Gronk smash, love it. Scott, are you making that trade as well? Are you trading Julius Thomas for Gronkowski, receiving Gronkowski?
I definitely am, and this is maybe looking a little bit too far in advance, but looking forward to the playoffs. I would rather have Gronkowski because you'd expect a game-to-game consistency, where if Julius Thomas fails to catch a touchdown, that could really hurt your chances. And I also wonder, I'm more scared of the Dolphins as a threat to the Patriots, making the Patriots play all the way through the season. Are we worried at all that the Broncos may not have to win the games in Week 16 and 17 this year? That's always a concern, I feel like.
There's certainly a possibility there, and these are things you have to consider. You don't want and don't have your fantasy championship in Week 17, folks. I know we harp on that one, but you don't want to run into a potential situation where you might have some players sitting. I know that's not exactly common, but it is a consideration to make if you're trying to win a championship here. So Gronkowski, absolutely there. We do have one other tight end question here in the queue in the chat, and it's regarding Jared Cook or Owen Daniels. Mike, who are you starting this week if you had to choose between those two?
I'm probably one of the bigger, at least this season, Jared Cook apologists. Scott, you and I just made a trade for him in Dynasty, where I'm still, years later, trying to recover from Aaron Hernandez, was my franchise tight end. I just have not been able to fill that gap in my lineup. My team's pretty good, but I can't fill that tight end spot. So I made the desperation move with some late round picks and I think it was Jared Boykin for Jared Cook. So I'm rooting for him because I think that, what people are kind of overlooking this year is his volume. I mean, he's been heavily involved in that offense. He's blocking well. The only problem is he's not scoring touchdowns. I think he's still number one in the league in targets among players without a touchdown. So I anticipate that changing considering how big this guy is and the force he should be in the end zone. So I think that'll bounce back. That all being said, Owen Daniels, Baltimore offense doing a decent job. They play Tennessee, who is giving up plenty of fantasy points to opposing passing games, and Daniels clearly heavily involved, picking right up where Dennis Pitta left off in this offense. So, we saw that coming off the injury last week, heavily involved. So I do think that Daniels is the right play, especially because, although I say Cook's seeing a lot of volume, it's tailed off a little bit the last couple of weeks, and it's enough to give Daniels a pretty good edge there.
Any concern with Lance Kendrick's involvement in the St. Louis offense?
A little bit. I mean, he has the 4 touchdowns. He's the guy stealing them from Jared Cook, unfortunately, at the goal line. But you have to imagine, I mean, and we've seen this a million times, this is kind of the premise for regression, is with volume comes touchdowns. I mean, if you just keep getting targets and targets and targets, you're going to find the end zone. And Cook did drop a touchdown, and he had a couple other targets near the end zone. So he could easily have 2 or 3 scores. And that would be enough to really vault him up, considering how many targets he has seen. So I think some of those Kendricks ones will go to Cook going forward, and he should be in for a borderline tight end one second half of the season.
Scott, your thoughts?
I think Daniels is definitely the much safer play here. He's been receiving a heavy target volume all season except for the couple games that he missed. He seems back and healthy. I think that's pretty definitive.
We'll keep it with the tight end question here. We have another one, a couple different players. And in a non-PPR league, we have Scott Chandler or Heath Miller. And, this is an interesting one. Chandler, one of those deeper streamer guys. Miller, obviously, 2 weeks ago, a massive game. But we know what you typically expect out of Miller is more catch and fall down. Pretty much the same out of Chandler. So, Mike, is this a slam dunk? You're starting Miller here, or do you give any consideration to Scott Chandler?
No consideration. I mean, maybe it's a little closer if Sammy Watkins and Fred Jackson or even one of them are out, and you would think then they would rely more on Chandler. But with them guys playing, I would definitely say Heath Miller, especially up against the Jets, who, although you anticipate Ben attacking the outside corners, obviously a huge issue, maybe the worst set of outside corners in the league, if not Baltimore, the way they're a mess right now. You have to imagine that Pittsburgh is going to come out and attack that. But, the Jets know that's coming, so it may open up some opportunities for Heath Miller. I think that he is a top 12 play this week, so I would go with Heath.
Anything to add on that one, Scott?
Yeah, Heath Miller's been a little bit sneaky this year. He's actually top 12 in targets right now this season at tight end with 46. And while Pittsburgh hasn't yet had their bye, I think that just makes him so much safer. You definitely have to go with Miller in this game.
Yeah, we know that certainly likes to feed Miller targets. So, and this matchup is a really nice matchup for the Steelers. So I'm going to agree there. Pretty easy one. All right, how about Eddie Lacy or Justin Forsett, Mike, in a PPR league?
Who is it? Forsett and who?
Eddie Lacy.
Lacy, yeah, that's a close one. I mean, I like Forsett this week. My concern with him is always going to be touchdown, just because, again, Taliaferro is a guy that's going to steal their goal line work. We saw that earlier in the year, too. Forsett just not getting a ton of goal line work. We've seen it mixed in a little bit, which is some optimism, but he does have a good matchup against Tennessee. It's an opportunity for Forsett to put together a big game, and probably a guy looking at in daily. He is, I think, undervalued there, so a guy to keep in mind there. Lacy, I have him a little lower. Chicago run defense, we think Chicago run defense think terrible, but last 7 weeks they've done a pretty good job against opposing running backs. So, I would not be rushing in there thinking, okay, well, this is Lacy's big 30-point week. Chicago defense decent there. And also we've seen up and down with Lacy. Some weeks he's sharing with Stark, some weeks he's not. So, it's a risk enough for me that I'm going with Forsett here. And I'm sure that's an unpopular decision, but that's I'm a little bit more comfortable with Forsett there in Baltimore.
You bring up a good point about the Chicago defense. Something people should know, that they are getting Lance Briggs back this week and John Bostic, two players who've been out. I mean, we've been seeing Christian Jones playing every down, and this is a guy who wasn't even drafted. So not for skill reasons, but a little extracurricular reasons is why he fell out of the draft. But still, huge upgrade, let's say, at the linebacker position. So that should really bode well for the Bears' run defense, not so good for the Packers' run game. But Scott, are you in on Forsett this week, or would you start Lacy there?
You said this was either a PPR or half-point PPR, Jeff. Is that right?
It's PPR, yes.
Yeah, I think the PPR is what skews it for me, and I know that Lacy had a lot of catches and yardage last week as a receiver, but that's not something that he's traditionally done. He's more in the 30 catches a year sort of range. So I think that Forsett gets the boost by the format. Whereas in standard scoring, I have them like both in the 10 to 12 range.
Fair enough. All right, now we have another, and I knew this was going to start coming up. Got another Mark Sanchez question, and this is interesting. Mark Sanchez, Carson Palmer, we've heard that one before, but let's toss Jay Cutler into the mix. And again, I think it was Evan Silva who put out on Roto World about Cutler's struggles in Green Bay. Everyone panicking. But, Mike, is there a reason to panic, or do you just start Cutler over Sanchez and Palmer and not worry about it, set and forget?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty close. I think they should score around the same amount of points. So, if you're more comfortable with Sanchez up against Carolina or even Palmer, I mean, I think I would scratch Palmer off my list. I'm more leaning towards Cutler or Sanchez. So, for me, it's very close, and I'd have no qualms with someone starting Sanchez. That being said, I do like Cutler a tiny bit more, so that's the direction I'd go.
How about you, Scott?
I have Cutler number one as well, but I actually have Palmer over Sanchez, so that's my order.
Yeah, I think you really can't go away from Cutler. I know, hey, the bad when it's bad is very bad, but that can be said for almost anybody. And really, when you look at the situation, skill level, wide receivers, Matt Forte bailing you out, you got to like Cutler there just a tad more. I do have him slightly higher in my rankings this week, and own him on plenty of teams where I actually was able to pick up Sanchez, and I am starting Cutler over Sanchez. So hitting home there, personal question as well. A full PPR, Mike. We have Michael Floyd, Michael Crabtree, Allen Robinson, Justin Hunter. can only start one out of that bunch. And this is an intriguing group for a number of reasons. So if you have to pick one, Michael Floyd, Michael Crabtree, Allen Robinson, Justin Hunter, who are you going with there?
Yeah, that is a tough one. Crabtree is my guy in this scenario. He's been, although he's struggled this year, which we thought he might with target volume in this offense. I mean, they've been throwing a little bit more, but they're just not producing as well as we expected. So, Crabtree, however, is getting, he's pretty much their goal line target, Kaepernick's goal line target. He is getting a ton of volume in that area. That's the good news, and that's what I kind of think separates him from this crew. Because we know he's a talent as well. So I think he's a borderline wide receiver too this week. Hunter, I mean, this is the week for these Baltimore wide receivers. The matchups across the board are outstanding against this Baltimore secondary. Danny Gore, he's probably going to start on the outside for Baltimore today. He was only playing the slot for Detroit, and they cut him, and now he's going to go into Baltimore, and within just a few days of learning the defense, which he has some experience in the past, is probably going to have to start on the outside. It's probably going to be a disaster. So, and even Matt Elam in the slot there against Kendall Wright. I mean, he's the safety there is playing some nickel corner there in the slot, and he has been getting just lit up and covered there as well. So this is really the opportunity for this Titans offense to get going. And I think Hunter definitely a sleeper this week. But I say all that, and I still think Crabtree just gets the edge over Hunter just because he's been so inconsistent this year.
How about you, Scott?
For me, it's actually Allen Robinson, and since Blake Bortles took over as the quarterback in Jacksonville in Week 3. Robinson has 59 targets. That's top 10 among wide receivers, tied with Jeremy Maclin and Kelvin Benjamin. He is a very sneaky wide receiver, too, I think, for me, the rest of this season. And I think that he is much safer because of that. Guys like Michael Crabtree maybe have the reputation as being those target guys. He's just not getting it this season. So don't let that Allen Hurns big game last week fool you. Allen Robinson's a wide receiver, too.
Very, very interesting. I actually agreed with the Crabtree take. Crabtree's a guy who I've been looking at in FanDuel very frequently this week to pull the curtain back a little bit. So, I'm going to agree with Mike there, but very interesting point from Scott. All right, so we have another tight end question. It looks like, a number of tight ends sitting out on waivers, and we're looking to stash somebody here for Ben for the rest of the season, Mike. We have Jordan Cameron obviously dealing with the concussion issues, Vernon Davis, Kyle Rudolph, and Jordan Reed all out there. Who would you take if you had to take one of those guys to stash?
Yeah, that's a tough one. There's a lot of talent on that list. I mean, I kind of led off my Fantasy 32 article at Insider this week with Vernon Davis, who since 2008, right up there with Gronkowski, is the best producers at the goal line or in the end zone. His end zone catch rate is best in the league among players with at least 25 targets in the end zone. He only has one end zone target this season. San Francisco, I don't know what they're doing offensively. They're just not using their players correctly. They need to get Davis. They need to lean more in that running game and get Davis to targets in the end zone. I think they have to know that that's an issue going forward. So I do think he bounces back. But I think right now Reed's probably the best play. I know he's been beat up at times, coming off the bad game with RG3 in Week 1 with RG3. He only had one target as well. But last year, if you extrapolate his production with RG3 over the full season, it was mid-pack tight end 1 numbers. There's no reason to believe that he doesn't start to get him the football more often. So I do like Reed the most out of this group going forward. But there's a lot of talent here. Any of those 4 guys can lead this group in fantasy points going forward. But I'd say Reed 1, Davis 2, Cameron 3, Rudolph 4.
Scott, what do you think here?
Yeah, I have the same order as Mike, and to me, it's either Reed or Davis because those are the 2 that have top 5 upside at the position. Even if Rudolph and Cameron come back, I think they're going to be inconsistent, more in the lower top 10. And I guess the fact that the Reed has been back and healthier and Davis hasn't been producing as much, Reed is the one that I would go with. He's on bye this week, but for the rest of the season, I'm probably going to rank him as a top 5 to 7 guy.
Yeah, and the ceiling's certainly there with all of these players, but Reed, this offense could be pretty interesting going forward, and I think Reed has a good opportunity to put up a lot of points. So you certainly like that. Remember, folks, if you're still hanging out with us, we got 9 minutes left in the show. You can get your questions answered in the chat or, of course, on Twitter with the hashtag #WarRoom. I'm not really seeing anything right now, Mike. Anything you've seen commonly come up, any common questions or do we want to address any issues here? I mean, Tony Romo is active, so maybe we can address that. And other thoughts here with 9 minutes left in the show?
Yeah, I'm noticing here it looks like for Atlanta, Harry Douglas is going to play. I think he's kind of underrated right now. I'm actually in a 16-team. It's actually a keeper league, but the benches are big enough that basically all wide receivers, ones, twos, threes, fours, and even fives should be owned. And Harry Douglas was sitting on waivers this week, and that kind of tells me he's not getting enough respect. I know he missed some time with injury, but in 3 full games, he's seen 18, 20, and 19% of Atlanta's targets, and this is among the pass-heaviest teams in the league. They score a decent number of touchdowns, so I don't think it's crazy to say that Douglas is going to produce at a wide receiver 3 level going forward, and maybe even back in wide receiver 2. I mean, especially if Roddy White doesn't really pick up in the effectiveness department, and I really like him today. I think Douglas should be, if you're looking for a wide receiver, look at him as your wide receiver 3 because he goes up against his Tampa Bay defense that is probably the worst against the pass over the last month or so. And, I know he's a little beat up and maybe tweaks something and misses out, but if you're just desperate at that spot, I don't think it's a bad guy to throw in your lineup, again, against Tampa. I think it's a great matchup, and he's been very busy when active this season.
All right, Scott, that's interesting. I maybe want to get your thoughts here as well on Harry Douglas.
Yeah, I guess I'm not as high on Douglas as Mike is, but it's not really because I'm such a fan of Roddy White necessarily or even Julio Jones. I just feel like the lack of offensive line help makes it really difficult for the Falcons to have an effective passing or running game, frankly. So I'm a little lower on all of these guys. I could definitely see using Douglas in a deeper league as sort of a wide receiver 3 or 4, but I'm not really in love with it as an option either.
Yeah, very interesting. It's a tough play to make. It's one of those, certainly in a deeper league, you might want to consider that, but 12-team or more or shallow league, probably not going to go in that direction. Now, Eddie is looking towards next year. He's looking at this is a dynasty question, and we, of course, have our dynasty specialist here, Scott. So I'll toss this over to you first, Scott. If you're looking, maybe it's a little bit more of a shallow league. There's potential guys like Sims. He mentioned Sims, Devontae Freeman, some guys like that. Who are you looking to stash that you think maybe will take a step forward in their second season, potentially become really viable, maybe RB2s or even RB1s? Who knows what happens? But guys that you're stashing on your bench and dynasty rosters.
Yeah, this question is really tough for me. I really want to see what Sims can do the rest of this season before I make much of a commitment. But I think I'm going to probably lean towards Devontae Freeman for now. I think it's fair to assume that Steven Jackson's run is going to be over. And as bad as the Falcons' offensive line has been, obviously that's a place they're going to try to address. They had a lot of injured guys this season, so maybe that's a place that can rebound next year. I feel like he's got the easier track to become the starter because, frankly, I think Bobby Rainey's a good player, and I think he could potentially establish himself as the primary option for the Bucs.
Any other running backs that you're looking at to stash? You see maybe in a good situation, increased workload. I mean, obviously an underwhelming draft class this year, but still some names that I'm thinking of somebody like Kadeem Carey or something like that. Players that you're targeting specifically to have on your bench or your taxi squad.
Yeah, I mean, most of those guys they're waiting on an injury or for their guy to head out in front of them. The one that I guess this is more for shallower type of formats, but Carlos Hyde is a guy that you could obviously see potentially starting next year for the 49ers and being an RB1 pretty much right out of the gate if he gets that job. So he's the one of that group that I probably lean at the heaviest. The one that's a bit deeper play and maybe more of a sleeper, I think Juwan Thompson in Denver is a guy that could really work out. I'm not really enamored with a lot of the Denver running back options, so I could see his role maybe increasing going forward as well.
And since we're on the topic, one more follow-up, and a frustrating player for a lot of folks. This is a player who I actually had as my number 4 running back going into the season. Because of opportunity, he was the top rookie running back taken, and the rookie running back, that is, number 4, Bishop Sankey, Scott. Now, what is your long-term perspective? And then even, Mike, I'd like to hear your long-term perspective on Bishop Sankey as well.
I mean, I definitely like Sankey more long-term than I like him the rest of this season. Sean Green has been sort of stealthily effective throughout the year this year, and so I don't really see him emerging except maybe over the last couple of weeks when it's going to be too late to use him. But sure, I could definitely see Sankey as a potential top 20 to 25 running back next season.
Mike, thoughts on that?
Yeah, my issue with Sankey going forward, and Scott kind of touched on it, is just the Titans' ineffective offense. I mean, going into the season, guys I liked were, I wasn't particularly high on Sankey just because I kind of knew it was kind of cut and dry that he was not going to start as the starter. It was going to take some time to earn that role. But, even like Justin Hunter or Cordero Patterson, I actually like Greg Jennings as a sleeper. And obviously those guys bit me this year, and the reason is because those offenses have been way worse than expected. We thought at least they'd be, mid-pack, kind of like they were last year, but they've both been terrible, two of the worst in the league, and that's really killed these guys, and that's going to hurt Sankey going forward. But, Dynasty, still young at 22. He's a lot of talent, of course, as you mentioned, first running back pick this year, and he's shown some flashes. I think he has the ability to be a pretty good back, maybe not, a 25 touch guy, but you don't need to necessarily be that anymore to be a borderline running back one. So I think there's a lot of ability there, and I think he's still a pretty strong dynasty hold.
Absolutely. All right, so another question. 3 minutes left in the show. Another question on Twitter. Looks like we might have missed this one earlier, Phil, so sorry about that. We are going to get it for you, and it's between Lamar Miller and Joy Bell. So, again, we sort of touched on these guys. Well, we didn't touch on Bell earlier, but we touched on Miller earlier. Mike, you have that decision. What are you going to do there?
Yeah, same game there. That's a tough one again. Two great defenses, so you're really taking a shot here and hoping one of them just manages to find the end zone. I'm going to go with Miller. I know that he's maybe not 100%, but I think he'll play enough there. I mean, even if you think he's going to share some touches, in Detroit, they're going to. Joy Bell may be the lead early down back, but he hasn't been too great this year, and he has a tough matchup with Miami. Also, Reggie Bush is going to play. He's going to steal carries. He's going to steal targets. And they also, and I believe this, I know we hear this with Coach Speak, I think Theo Riddick is going to steal, especially from Reggie Bush, but maybe even a carry or two or a snapper or five here from Joy Bell. I think they want to get all these guys involved. So I'm just not too excited about Bell, and I think Miller just a slightly better play here.
Agree, Scott?
I do. And coming off the bye, I think Reggie Bush is probably healthy now for the first time in quite a while this season. So I actually prefer Bush over Bell, in fact, which is why I lean Lamar Miller as the best of these options.
Yeah, I agree. Certainly, it's not a matchup that you want to play really either player in, but if you have to make that decision, you're going to go with that, with Miller there. Now, a question from Eddie about team defense. Really looking forward. Rest of the season, best option. I never really like to do this. I look at team defense as a week-to-week battle because the landscape can shift, certainly. But if you really want something crazy and you really think you're going to make the championship or you're going to at least make the semifinals in Week 15, the Tennessee Titans, man. The Tennessee Titans. How about that? They have the New York Jets in Week 15, and they get the Jags in Week 16. I know somebody's going to see this eventually in everybody's league, and they're going to stash the Titans. So if you really want to get ahead of the curve, the Tennessee Titans. Otherwise, just play week to week. One more question from Justin, then we'll wrap things up here. Carson Palmer, rest of the season. Outlook for him, or is there any chance we might roster Zach Mettenberger given his playoff schedule?
I'd probably stay away from Mettenberger, until we see it from him. He's probably not going to produce. Again, the Titans offense struggling badly. Carson Palmer, they're scoring touchdowns the last 3 weeks since he's been back against Oakland, Philadelphia, Dallas. I don't know that they're going to be able to keep that rate up. We haven't seen that from Palmer in the past in a long time, and especially last year. So I don't think they're going to keep scoring touchdowns this way. And also, like I said, I think that touchdown-interception ratio evens out. I mean, this guy is in his mid-30s. It's not like he's just emerging into a good quarterback. He's been throwing picks for a long time, a ton the last couple of years. So I think he's going to kind of level off as maybe a good quarterback two, more so than a quarterback one. So that's kind of my outlook on him.
Yeah, he's having that sort of Nick Foles-like 2013 season with the sort of avoiding interceptions on flukes in some cases. So, yeah, I certainly agree there. You're going to stay away from Mettenberger, although you got to love the look that this kid has. Anyway, that's going to do it for this week. We went 1 minute over for you there, overtime. We're going to hit it for Week 10, so best of luck to you guys. We'll be back here next week, same time, same place. So for Pro Football Focus Fantasy, for Mike Clay, for Scott Spratt, I'm Jeff Ratcliffe, and that's a wrap.